So today I'm really excited that we're going to be hearing about youth drinking in decline, implications for policy and practice. And we're joined by Dr. Inge Kersbergen and Dr. Laura Fenton. Inge is a Society for the Study of Addiction academic fellow in the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield. Her research focuses on social and environmental influences on health behaviour, particularly alcohol consumption. And Inge has examined how reductions to the serving size of alcohol in food can be used to decrease alcohol consumption and energy intake. Dr. Laura Fenton is a research associate in the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield and in the School of Environment, Education and Development at the University of Manchester. Laura's research builds on her doctoral work on the changing place of alcohol in the lives of 3 generations of British women. And her areas of expertise include alcohol use, gender, the life course, and biographical methods. So I'm delighted now to hand over to Inge and Laura to hear about their important work on youth drinking in decline. And I think Inge's going to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, please stop me if that hasn't shown up as a full set of slides. Thank you very much for the introduction, Carol, and thank you to everyone for coming to our talk. Before we start off, we want to thank the Wellcome Trust for funding this research, and we declare that we have no conflicts of interest. In the next 50 minutes or so, Laura and I will be presenting recent work that was conducted as part of the Youth Drinking in Decline project. And the Youth Drinking in Decline project is a mixed methods project that investigates decline in youth drinking. And even though we're the ones presenting the work today, it's very much a team effort and we are very grateful for current and past researchers on the project. In this talk, we will first outline what has happened with youth drinking in the past few decades and what mechanisms have been proposed to explain these trends. And then we will summarize 3 recent studies that we conducted that dig further into potential mechanisms. And we'll conclude by highlighting the implications for policy from each of these studies. So the headline news is young people are drinking less. Since 2003, the proportion of secondary school children in England who have ever drunk alcohol has dropped from 61% to just 38%. And the proportion who drank in the week before the survey fell from 25% to 8%. And among young adults, between 16 and 24-year-olds, we see a similar trend, with the proportion drinking in the last week falling from 66% to just 40%. We could show more similar trends showing rising abstinence rates among young people, lower consumption levels among those who do drink, and less frequent drunkenness. It's a very clear picture. Young people today are drinking much less today than young people did 15 to 20 years ago. And this isn't just happening in the UK. The prevalence of weekly drinking has declined across the world. And as you can see here, the biggest decline in weekly drinking prevalence was seen in England, Denmark, Scotland, and Wales. But this is also partly because those countries had some of the highest peaks in youth drinking before. Looking more closely at the international decline, we see that it has not happened all at once, but it's followed each other closely throughout the world. The decline started in North America in the 1990s, then spread to Scandinavia, across the Anglosphere, and finally across most of Western and Central Europe by the early 2010s. Another interesting feature of the decline in youth drinking is that it appears pretty universal across the population. The data shows that the decline in boys and girls, in all socioeconomic groups, and in younger and older adolescents. Previous research led by Melissa Oldham showed that youth drinking has declined across the whole distribution of drinkers. The graph on the screen shows that even the heaviest drinkers today drink less than the heaviest drinkers in the past. And you can see that this decline has been much steeper at the top end of the distribution than at the lower end. The decline in school-aged children seems robust, but there's some debate about whether it's continuing into adulthood. And this is very important because rates of harm for most alcohol-related health conditions peak in middle and older age. So we might not see the full benefits if young people are simply delaying their start to drinking, but then drinking as much as ever when they are adults. So earlier I showed you clear evidence that young adults in England are drinking less. And our colleagues from Australia who examined the same topic found a slightly more nuanced outcome. They compared 5 recent birth cohorts, including those born from the late 1970s to those born around the turn of the millennium. And for each of these cohorts, they looked at the age trends in 3 outcomes: drinking in the last year, regular risky drinking in the last year, and total alcohol consumption. The graph I showed you on the screen shows the predicted probability of drinking in the last year for each cohort by their age groups. And you can see that there's a big difference between the cohorts at age 14 on the left-hand side of the graph, but the difference is almost entirely closed up by age 24, suggesting that this decline in drinking is not fully sustained into adulthood. So young adults born in early 2000s are equally likely to drink as those born in the late 70s. But the same study did show a maintained reduction in consumption levels. So even though the prevalence of consumption is fairly similar, total consumption stayed lower for more recent cohorts. These are very important findings because it suggests that the decline in youth drinking today might result in future reductions in alcohol-related harm compared to previous generations.
Okay, so we'll now turn to look at why young people are drinking less. So this is a question that has attracted substantial attention from researchers in recent years. And our own research group has looked at it, but so have colleagues in Australia, Sweden, Finland, Germany, New Zealand, and the US. And several years into this work, no one has yet come up with a satisfactory answer. It increasingly looks like there is no single direct driving force behind the decline. And instead, it appears more likely that it is the product of a complex mix of wider social and cultural shifts that cannot easily be captured in statistical analyses. But nevertheless, let's have a look at some of the reasons that have been considered. So Avik Bhattacharya from the Institute for Alcohol Studies wrote one of the most useful summaries on the topic to date. And he identified several possible explanations, which we'll go through in turn before looking at a few in more detail. So first, he suggests that it might be due to better enforcement of alcohol policies aimed at deterring underage drinking. So particularly underage sales laws, which have become more stringent in some of the countries that have seen the decline. Notably, though, not all the countries that have seen the decline. Second, he pointed to new technologies, particularly the internet, smartphones, gaming, and social media, which may be diverting young people towards other forms of socializing. Third, new social norms that don't value and valorize heavy drinking, as was previously the case, might be part of the explanation. So these norms might include greater health consciousness and sort of new forms of femininity and masculinity that are less tied to alcohol. Next, today's young people may be more health conscientious and conscientious overall, and as such are less motivated to drink alcohol for negative reasons like self-medication, and more likely to avoid alcohol for positive reasons, such as concentrating on their education. Fifth, changes in parenting mean that young people may experience better communication and warmer relationships with their parents. Parents may be more likely to know about and monitor their children's whereabouts and activities. Six, demographic shifts, particularly an increased number of young people in the population from ethnic minority communities with a tradition of lower alcohol consumption or abstinence may be part of this overall pattern. And lastly, reduced affordability of alcohol and lower economic confidence about young people's future in the face of economic crisis may also be part of the explanation. So as I say, there's no compelling evidence for any one of these explanations as a primary driver of the decline at the moment, but these are the main ones that people have been investigating. So if we were together in a room right now and I asked how many of you think it's the internet that's driving the decline in youth drinking, quite a few of you would probably put up your hands. And the internet and the technologies that flow from it are kind of an obvious explanation for the decline in youth drinking because they fit the profile of the kind of cause we're looking for. So firstly, it emerged as a mass phenomenon around the same time that the decline started, with broadband internet connections becoming available in the late 1990s, early 2000s, followed by smartphones and social media in the mid 2000s. And like the decline in youth drinking, it's an international phenomenon. It has fundamentally reshaped everyday life in ways big enough to explain such a major change in drinking. This includes reshaping the ways young people communicate, produce and engage with culture, gain information, develop or maintain relationships. But the mechanisms for an impact on alcohol consumption are also clear to see. So young people may spend more time socializing online and less time socializing offline, where they would have opportunities to drink alcohol. They spend more time in the home, supervised by parents. The fear of public shaming when drunken escapades are posted on social media is widely reported in the qualitative research to be a concern. And in a broader sense, the internet and social media may provide access to a range of cultures and identities that hadn't been available to previous generations of young people. But there's a problem. Researchers can't find a robust enough relationship between higher levels of internet, smartphone, or social media use and lower levels of alcohol consumption, no matter how hard they try. In fact, they usually find the opposite, that greater use of these technologies is associated with more alcohol consumption. And this is one of the great puzzles of the topic. How can an explanation that almost everyone who works on the topic finds compelling be so overwhelmingly contrary to the evidence? So there are some potential counter arguments here as well. Firstly, most surveys are not very good at measuring technology use, often using crude usage frequency metrics, which aren't sensitive enough to separate intensive daily users from casual daily users. They also do not differentiate what young people do with the technology, and they therefore risk treating information seekers, communicators, content producers as though they all are alike. Second, there may be multiple paths from internet-based technology use to alcohol consumption, and these paths may point in different directions. So for example, exposure to high levels of alcohol advertising online may promote drinking, while engagement with health and well-being content, also online, may prevent it. So, and concern about shaming social media also works in this way. So it may limit consumption, but higher levels of social activity may promote it. So unless we can separate out these pathways, we may misspecify the relationship between technology and alcohol use. Finally, most studies examine the relationship between internet use and at the individual level. So internet use and alcohol consumption at the individual level. However, the greatest impact of the internet on young people's lives may not be how it directly affects their behavior as individuals, but how it reshapes youth culture in a broader sense, changing shared aspirations, attitudes, dispositions, and practices as a generation, irrespective of how any one individual uses the internet. So some of the qualitative research shows this nicely, highlighting how young people's perspectives on alcohol have fundamentally shifted. The first quote is from research with non and light drinkers in Australia, where the researchers found that the exact same things that earlier research had identified as reasons to drink among young people, so relaxing into your authentic self, heightening intimacy, losing control, were now reasons not to drink. Similarly, in Sweden, researchers argued that their data suggested that alcohol has lost its unquestioned symbolic significance as cool and as a rite of passage to adulthood. Instead, there is less peer pressure and more room for choice. So before moving on, we want to briefly touch on one other area that often gets raised. Most people's response when they hear about the decline is to say, yes, but they're taking drugs instead. And there's limited evidence to support this. During the period when alcohol consumption declined among young people in England, smoking rates also plummeted from 49% of secondary school children ever smoking, having ever smoked in the late 1990s to just 16% in 2018. And we actually see a similar pattern for drugs during those years. Further, the age of initiation of all these substances is going up. So this graph comes from work from colleagues that my colleagues did with our collaborators in Australia. And it shows that the mean age of first use of alcohol, cigarettes and cannabis rose by more than a year between 2001 and 2016.
So now you know about declining youth drinking and the potential reasons behind it. We want to now discuss 3 pieces of work that have recently been conducted in our team, and they all point to potential implications for policy. So most of these have not been published yet, so we're getting your findings hot off the press. So the first one we'll show you is recent research led by Abby Stevely, and this work looks at the decline in youth drinking through the lens of a greater focus on healthier behaviors among young people. So as Laura said, one of the proposed reasons for the decline in youth drinking is that young people have gotten healthier overall and focus more on well-being. And the research conducted by Abby aimed to understand how alcohol consumption is associated with other health behaviors and well-being in general, and how this may have changed over time. So the study used the health behaviors in school-aged children study to analyze this. It's a repeat cross-sectional study that was collected in 4 waves between 2001 and 2013. And it samples 11, 13, and 15-year-olds. And the analysis includes a little over 5,500 participants. So the analysis looked at the relationship between a bunch of variables that were selected with input from stakeholders. The risk behaviors we looked at were weekly alcohol use, smoking status, lifetime cannabis use, and sexual activity. Protective health behaviors were physical activity and fruit and veg intake. And we also looked at academic achievement and perceived school pressure. And we looked at various social relationship variables, including social support from classmates, the extent to which kids engage in remote communications, so, on their phone or on the internet, and whether they can communicate well with at least one of their parents. And the final variable we included was overall life satisfaction. So for the analysis, Abby used latent class analysis. This analysis tries to find common combinations of variables and identify types of young people based on these clusters of variables. So imagine that all the colored circles on my slide are a variable, and the size of the circle represents how strongly a variable is related with a certain type of young person. What the analysis tries to find out is what types of young people, what clusters of variables exist among the variables I just mentioned, and then how these clusters have changed over time. And there's really 2 ways in which these can change. So first, they become more or less common. So, the type 1 person might become more common or less common over time. But secondly, also the strength of the association. So the size of these circles could change over time. And the analysis was trying to figure out both. So the first cluster that was identified was called the unhealthy cluster. This cluster is characterized by higher levels of risky behavior, including sexual activity, alcohol use, smoking, and cannabis use. And alongside this, these kids engaged in lower levels of healthy behaviors. So they have lower levels of physical activity and fruit and vegetable consumption. They also experience greater school pressure and less good relationships with their classmates and parents. And they had lower levels of life satisfaction. The second cluster that was identified was called the healthy cluster. These kids were very unlikely to engage in risky behaviors and more likely to engage in healthy behaviors. They have higher levels of physical activity and fruit and veg consumption. They feel less pressured at schools and have better relationships with their parents. And they also have higher levels of life satisfaction. And the final cluster we identified is a combination of the healthy and unhealthy clusters. Like the healthy cluster, this cluster is unlikely to engage in risk behavior. But like the unhealthy cluster, they also don't engage in the protective behaviors. So they're showing some risk indicators that we would normally associate with risk behaviors, but they're not performing the risk behaviors themselves. The shape of these clusters has remained fairly stable over time. So all clusters shows an increase in remote communication over time. As you might expect, it's become far more common to use the internet. And they all show a reduction in alcohol consumption over time, even the ones in the unhealthy cluster. However, the number of kids that belong to each of these clusters has changed over time. So the graph you see on the screen shows the percentage of kids in each survey wave that belong to the different clusters. And you can see that in 2001, only 20% of kids belong to the healthy cluster, and this grew to almost 40% in 2013. And the opposite is the case for the unhealthy cluster. This drops from 40% in 2001 to around 20% in 2013. So excellent news, right? They're all getting better over time. It's a bit more complicated than that. When you split the data by family affluence, then you see that not all groups have made this shift. So the kids from high and medium affluence families are indeed much less likely to be in the unhealthy cluster over time. But this has barely changed for kids from low affluence family. There we see that still around 40% of kids in this group remain in the unhealthy cluster. So the results show that the decline in youth drinking has coincided with a shift from unhealthy behavior to healthy behaviors, and that far more young people engage in protective behaviors. But it's really important to note that these shifts are socially patterned, and young people in poorer households may be left behind a bit, as they have remained equally likely to be in the unhealthy cluster as before. And it's important to understand what is causing these inequalities and make sure that there are policies in place to ensure that kids from poorer households can also follow this shift towards healthier behavior.
Okay, so moving on from adolescents, we'll now turn to young adults, and specifically young adults who are university students. So as we've discussed, young people's alcohol consumption has fallen sharply since the early 2000s. However, university campuses have retained their reputation as intoxicogenic environments in which heavy drinking is typical and acceptable. So our qualitative work has looked at why this is the case. So existing research suggests that attending to the intersecting relational, temporal, and spatial features of students' drinking sheds light on its prevalence. And in terms of its relational dimensions, drinking is a practice that is oriented towards forging connections within groups. Drinking together is understood to be a significant part of how students form social bonds with one another. Temporally, the transition to university is a particularly significant period in time for social bonding and group formation, and thus for heavy drinking. As alcohol facilitates social connection among students, non and low drinking students may become excluded from or marginalized within peer and friendship groups because of their lack of participation in drinking at the start of their first year, when connections begin to be formed. So in Brown and Murphy's study of the role of alcohol in the transition to university, students who did not drink or who drank lightly found forging connections to be more challenging. They found that it took longer to form peer groups than it did for those who drank, and they were more likely to experience initial difficulties in establishing friendships. And moving beyond the initial transition to university, a small but growing literature explores how non and low drinking students manage social situations involving alcohol. So Dominic Conroy's work looks at how abstinent students explain their decision not to drink to others, particularly when they cannot fall back on culturally accepted reasons like medical or religious reasons. And this in related studies offers significant insight into the experiences and identity constructions of non and low drinking students. However, by treating such students as an exception, a kind of special of increasingly large group of people, this literature might risk missing the transformative nature of the decline on all students drinking. So it's not simply the case that there are likely to be more incoming students who avoid alcohol, but that all incoming students, including those who do drink, have less experience on the whole with alcohol than preceding cohorts and are part of a generation where alcohol has a diminishing importance. So in other words, there's a growing kind of disconnect between the intoxicogenic environments of universities as institutions and the prior experiences and sensibilities of a large proportion of their students. So given that drinking among students is oriented towards generating a sense of belonging and social connection, we draw on theories of belonging and relationality as a conceptual backbone in our work on students. The concept of belonging has two general meanings: a social meaning, in which it refers to an attachment to a particular group, like a family or a country, like a family, not a country, and a spatial meaning, in which it refers to attachment to a place, like a country. In the context of higher education, belonging has been defined as an emotional attachment to one's university, which involves feeling at home, feeling safe. And in Gravett and Ajari's recent reconceptualization of belonging, they position it as a relational and situated process. This is because we are always renegotiating our sense of belonging, depending upon our context. So approaching belonging in this way allows for attention to its fluidity. We also draw attention in our work on university students to how personal relationships can attenuate the impact of social norms around drinking. So the relational turn, as developed in the sociology of personal life, highlights how social life is navigated in and through personal relationships. The influence of social norms, such as peer pressure to drink heavily, is attenuated by the more immediate context of our relationships with others. And relationships in the sociology of personal life are seen as developing an open-ended process and not according to pre-existing rules. So it's a history of interaction and reciprocity that generates feelings of affection and obligation towards certain individuals. And ongoing relationships with others can be crucial in shaping how we respond to social norms. So for the qualitative component of the Youth Drinking and Decline project, in 2018-19, colleagues interviewed, mainly my colleague Victoria Fairbrother, interviewed 141 people aged 12 to 34 about the place of alcohol in their lives. And this included interviews with many university students. This particular piece of work looks at 21 university students. And these interviews were conducted in 2019, so prior to the pandemic. As you can see, the sample was mixed with respect to gender and drinking styles, and there was a degree of ethnic diversity as well. Students were recruited from a red brick and a post-92 university and a Northern English city. So starting university was not just an important educational transition, but also a significant point of transition in the drinking careers of most of our interviewees. Prior to university, most had tried alcohol, either with their parents or with groups of friends, but consistent with recent cohorts of young people in the wider population, several had limited experience with heavy drinking. The drinking occasions they encountered upon starting university were of a different nature and scale. And reflecting on the experience of encountering ritualized and normalized heavy drinking as a first-year student, Brendan comments, I think if you're a non-drinker and go to university, suddenly you go, oh, flip, this is a whole other world. People do drink to excess at uni, and perhaps this is how we roll. So you have freshers, you are surrounded by people who are wanting to get smashed. So before entering university, Brendan had drunk at home with his parents. He'd also been given cans of beer to get together at friends' houses. But once starting university, he began pre-drinking spirits with flatmates, followed by going to nightclubs. So much heavier drinking, really. And like Brendan, Alice first encountered ritualized heavy drinking as a fresher. She had some experience of drinking with friends prior to university, but the drinking at university, again, was of a different order. So she says first year was a bit of a shock to the system. I'd gone from a sheltered childhood where people don't really drink a lot, and then I go to university and it's like, whoa, it was like people were drinking much more than I'd seen them drink before. So for Alice, like several others, starting university meant becoming involved in scenes of heavy drinking. Most interviewees lived in purpose-built student housing in their first year, and pre-drinking prior to going to nightclubs was the main form of drinking together within this space, and it usually took place in communal areas. So Melanie, a 20-year-old student at the post-92 university, saw her living arrangements as central to the start of her drinking at university. I first started drinking with flatmates, she says, because obviously it was Freshers Week. I mean, it was what everyone did. My entire flat went out. We'd go get stuff from a shop, like the cheapest kind of stuff you can find, get drunk at pre-drinks, sometimes play games, and then we go to a nightclub. So in her account, Melanie suggests an inevitability about the link between heavy drinking and the start of university. When asked if her motivation on a night out was to get drunk, she replies with a degree of ambivalence about this inevitability. Says everyone else was doing it. I think it's obviously like you're just lumped in with these people that you don't know. And it's hard to be a bit different. And also, like, pretty much the only thing they'd ever meet up for was to drink. So if I wanted to make friends with them, I kind of had to drink. So the transition to university for many first-year students living in student housing involved them feeling as though heavy drinking was compulsory. So like flatmates, student societies were described as an important source of community and belonging, and sports teams' weekly socials in particular were synonymous with heavy drinking. Caroline, a third-year student of Black African origin at the Red Brick University, lamented the fact that her team's socials involved heavy drinking. Every week there's a heavy drinking social, and I know that's the case in a lot of clubs. I don't enjoy binge drinking. I don't enjoy activities where you basically have to be drunk to enjoy them. I found it hard, like I didn't fit in very well with the club because I didn't go out and drink with them a lot. So Caroline's sense of fitting in with fellow members of her club was stymied by the club's reliance on heavy drinking as the main forms of socializing. And another participant, Henry, continued to take part in social events involving heavy drinking, despite giving up alcohol after Freshers Week. In his interview, he describes the challenges of not drinking at the socials organized by sports clubs in the months that followed, and how a small minority tried to pressure him into drinking. And he talks about how he navigates these spaces by avoiding this minority and ensuring he is surrounded by the more supportive, or at least indifferent, majority, particularly fellow members of his own club. To him, he is known as Henry, as opposed to that guy who doesn't drink. This navigation strategy is all the easier to enact when he is in the company of his flatmates. So I'll just give you a minute to read the quote on the slide. So according to Henry, his flatmate's concern was that he was sociable and not whether he drank alcohol, accepting shots of gravy or fermented milk, sounds lovely, as substitutes for spirits. The point was that he participated in the rituals. That this is more strongly the case among his flatmates than his sports teams suggests that the intensity of personal relationships, so how well one is known as an individual and as part of the group, are important in overriding the pressure to drink. While some participants continued to drink heavily as they progressed through their university careers, most notably those who continued to live with other students, most found that the conditions encouraging heavy drinking in first year were no longer in place, or at least not to the same extent. So student trajectories through university often diverge after first year, with some studying abroad or taking up work or voluntary placements, which means time away from the spaces of student life in which belonging through drinking is negotiated. More commonly, other practical changes related to the structure of degrees at English universities explain why most of our participants reduce their heavy drinking as they progress through university. The first year of a degree in English universities typically counts less, if at all, towards the final classification achieved for the degree, whereas third year typically counts for a sizable portion. So just to conclude, our findings suggest that heavy drinking is produced by students' entrance into and participation in the specific spaces of student life in which belonging is negotiated. The first year is a particularly important juncture in their drinking careers, as many young people now enter university with limited experience of heavy drinking, yet rituals of heavy drinking remain key to the formation of a sense of belonging. Abstaining or drinking lightly while socializing in intoxigenic environments is no small accomplishment, as Dominic Conroy has pointed out. However, personal relationships in such contexts can override the pressure to drink at times. The accounts of participants who do not drink heavily suggest that the key factors wishing to reduce the imperative to drink in intoxigenic settings is to create opportunities for new students to negotiate relationships and become known as social persons prior to when heavy drinking becomes an essential mechanism of group formation. So understanding how heavy drinking produces belonging gives us possibilities to create opportunities for incoming cohorts of students with limited experience or interest in alcohol to negotiate belonging. And the decline in youth drinking and the rising number of students who abstain or moderate presents universities with responsibilities to rethink the provision of social activities beyond existing ways of operating, something that Brown and Murphy have also pointed out in their research. One way to address the issue is to provide students with opportunities for students to get to know one another during the early months of first year in ways that don't involve alcohol, but also where there's no expectation that they would. So they're not labeled as alcohol-free events, because that sort of separates and to some extent even stigmatizes non-drinkers. But events like walks in the countryside, trips to the cinema and so forth, where there isn't an expectation that alcohol would be a focus of the activity. And we found that this practice actually was already in place among some of the core societies and was really valued by our participants. So I'll just conclude there.
So we'll now talk about the final piece of work for today. As Laura mentioned earlier, one of the proposed reasons for the decline in youth drinking is that policy measures to prevent underage people from buying alcohol are just being policed and monitored better, and that young people are less able to buy or get alcohol in other ways. Well, the piece of research that I'm discussing can't speak to the effects of policies per se. It's looking at trends in how underage drinkers get their alcohol. This research is led by Maddie Henney, and it aims to understand how alcohol acquisition has changed. So in the wider context of fewer young people drinking, where are those who are still drinking getting their alcohol from? Maddie used the Smoking, Drinking and Drug Use Survey to answer this question. It's a repeat cross-sectional survey that is collected every 2 years, and we use data between 2000 and 2018. It collects data from 11 to 15-year-olds, and we have a total sample of around 43,000 drinkers for these analyses. So let's start with buying. The graph on the screen shows you trends in different ways of buying alcohol. On the x-axis, we have survey year. On the y-axis, we have odds ratio. I've drawn a line at the odds ratio of 1. So if the trends that I'm showing you go above that, that means that buying has increased over time. And if the trend goes below that, it means that buying has decreased. So first off, buying in the on-trade and the off-trade. You can see that while off-trade buying had a slight increase for a number of years, that both on-trade and off-trade buying have reduced in 2018 compared to 2000. Contrast this to buying from family or friends, which has increased, online, which has increased quite markedly in the last couple of years, and other places such as on the street or buying from other people and friends or family. We'll zoom in a bit more on buying from licensed premises first. The graph on the left shows a clear decrease in the likelihood that the young person tried to buy alcohol from a shop or a pub in the last 4 weeks before completing the survey. But the graph on the right does not show the same decrease in whether they were successful or not. So it seems that even though fewer young people recently tried to purchase alcohol from a licensed premise, those who did were equally likely to succeed as before. But there are many ways in which young people can get alcohol without having to buy it. The graph in this slide shows trends in where young people got the alcohol that they didn't buy. And as before, I've drawn a line in an odds ratio of 1, and any trends above that show an increased likelihood, and below that, a decreased likelihood. So first off, since 2004, we see a decline in getting alcohol from parents, and then an increase since about 2012. And similarly, getting alcohol from other family members follows a similar path to parents, and getting alcohol from another person, such as friends, also increased. Trends in whether children took the alcohol from their own home or someone else's home with the permission of the owner also follow a similar path to the family trends. So these decline early on in the sort of trend in the decline in youth drinking, but then increase from sort of 2010 to 2012 onwards. Finally, we also see that the likelihood of kids having stolen the alcohol from either their own home or somewhere else has increased during this time. So this study shows us that indeed there has been a decrease in young people buying their alcohol from licensed premises. It's possible that this could be due to more effective age restriction monitoring, but that's not something we could look at in the study. However, alongside this reduction in the ability to buy alcohol, and maybe because of that reduction, we see an increase in social supply of alcohol to young people from a range of sources, including parents or other family members and peers. And the increase in stealing alcohol could be a cause for concern, even though it needs to be noted that it's quite a small proportion of children who report that they've done this. But it's very important for us to understand how the social supply works and find ways that we can counteract the social supply to underage drinkers. So that brings us to the final thoughts of this presentation. So to recap, there has been a large and long-term decline in youth drinking in high-income countries. And the decline is the result of a mix of social and cultural shifts and perhaps some policy changes. The research in the field has shown it's unlikely to be a single explanation and instead a combination of complex factors that drive this. The decline in youth drinking is likely very good news for public health and the generations of young people that are in this decline. As there is evidence that the decline at least partially persists until adulthood, these generations might be less likely to experience alcohol harm in the future. And it's really important that we understand how we can harness the effects of the decline and gain the most health benefits from that, also for future generations of children. So the research we presented today point to some actions that could be taken to try to amplify the effects of the decline. So firstly, the research by Abby Stevely showed that the decline in youth drinking occurred alongside a general shift towards more healthy behavior. But she also showed that there are social inequalities in this shift and that young people from poorer backgrounds have not seen as large a decline in the unhealthy behavior pattern. She also showed that a substantial group of children still exhibit risk factors, even though they're not engaging in risk behaviors. So it's important to understand this group of people better and understand if there are other harmful behaviors they're engaging in that we might not have captured. But what's really key now is to understand why children from poorer backgrounds have not seen the same shifts toward healthier behavior patterns and put mechanisms in place that counteract any barriers to healthy behaviors that these groups might experience. Secondly, Laura showed us that despite the declining youth drinking, starting university is linked to heavy drinking for many students. And universities have a key role to play in maintaining declining youth drinking. And there are measures they could put in place to decentralize alcohol in the university experience. What Laura showed is that it's important for students, not just that universities provide explicit non-drinking spaces, but that there are activities that are being offered that don't revolve around alcohol or the lack of drinking in the first place. Building connections with fellow students is really important in the first year of university. And as long as the main way to get to know people is a drinking context, the transition to university might encourage heavier drinking. And universities have the means to change that within their individual cultures. And then finally, Maddie's work showed that purchasing from licensed premises has been taken over by social supply from parents, family, and friends. Social supply is a quite complex market and system, and it's important to understand exactly how it works and why different groups supply alcohol to underage drinkers. And public health bodies might consider campaigns to reduce social supply. For example, awareness campaigns for parents and other families about the effects of alcohol on growing children, because these are now becoming the pathways to which underage drinkers are getting the alcohol. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts on the policy implications of the decline in youth drinking. And I want to end by acknowledging the Wellcome Trust for funding this project and thanking you for your attention. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much indeed, Inge and Laura. That was an enormous amount of information and fascinating findings that you reported there. It was really great to hear that. We've got some questions in the chat that I'm going to go to now. I wonder if we can go to Richard de Visser first of all, just going back to talking about the really interesting ideas about social media and internet use and how you kind of debunk this in some ways, or said there's really no convincing evidence around this. And Richard's making the point about social media and internet use supporting a range of different messages. Richard, do you want to come in and ask this, please?
Yeah, sure. And I was just thinking as we're going along, and it came up in some of the presentations as well, about saying things like, at the same time as there might be some social groups where drinking isn't encouraged or other things are encouraged more, whatever sports team or whatever social group, whatever else is doing it at the same time. So we wouldn't just say that student societies aren't doing this anymore, or the internet is doing this or doing that. So I think there just needs to be a more fine-grained kind of approach to look at things like, because, you know, at the same time, there's that really interesting stuff that, you know, various people have done. We've been looking at, you know, alcohol-related identities online and how they're kind of constructed and managed and maintained, and presenting certain images and not others to present drinking in a kind of positive way, if you like, in the same way that there might be other people saying, oh, look at this, isn't it terrible? So I guess the point is that whether we're looking at online or the kind of in real life kind of context, it's thinking about not just how much people are socializing or where, but a little bit more detail about what are they doing in those different spaces as well. I mean, I'm not expecting you to have the answers and do that, because it actually requires really difficult stuff to get at. But I think it's an interesting one to think about, and also not to think about the online bit as being almost like a separate, different thing from being the offline kind of stuff as well. That they're actually mixing within and out each other, and the stuff about managing the kind of online presence is a reflection of and feeds back into the online interactions as well. If people weren't having those online interactions, they wouldn't be so worried, I guess, in some ways about how they're presenting themselves or being presented by others online as well. But yeah, but I mean, I found the whole thing really interesting. I keep thinking about how to disentangle this kind of the changes you see in some places and the kind of lack of change in others, and you know, the fact that you could have something constant but it's being fed by different reasons as well. It's all really, we'll be busy for ages.
Yeah, can I just come back on that? Yeah, thank you, Richard. I completely agree. Right now, a colleague in Australia is leading a paper that uses something called social, okay, I'm going to get it wrong now that I'm on the spot, using a particular line of theory that really kind of takes seriously the object world and the material world within social life. Yeah, I can't think of the name of it. And that's been really useful to sort of understand the way that technology intersects with practice, social practice theory, that's it. And so we're sort of developing that line of thinking at the minute with colleagues in Australia. And I think that what you're saying is absolutely true, that we can't see them as separate, and we have to recognize the way that they pull in different directions simultaneously.
Yeah, no, great, thanks very much.
Inge, did you want to come in at the moment? No? Okay. Great.
Nah, Laura knows all.
Yeah, I'm going to go on to another question in a minute, but some of the questions in the chat really brought up the issue of gender, which I know also is one of Laura's interests. I don't know about Inge as well, but I guess that there's been quite a lot of work done, as Richard alluded to, about how people kind of construct their gendered identities online through their chat about alcohol, and the way that women do this perhaps differently from men, and also the way that this might play out differently for class. And obviously class is one of the, socioeconomic status is something that you've mentioned here. And there's been some Australian research which highlighted how middle class youth were much more concerned about the way they presented themselves online in case employers were looking at, if they were presenting themselves drunk online, whereas more working class women in this study were less concerned about that. So I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to sort of talk about in terms of gender or in class here.
First of all, can I just say it's Victoria Whitaker who conducted most of the interviews for this research. I believe I called her Victoria Fairbrother when I speak. I just want to give her due credit because she did a huge amount of work for us. And so, yeah, and in our interviews in relationship to social media, people we didn't quite get that same finding around the intense concern around how they'd be presented, say, on Facebook, because I think they've come to the point, people come to the point now where they're very savvy in terms of monitoring who can see what. And then actually the technologies that are often most used by them are more sort of like group messaging, and things where it wasn't such performances online wasn't such a concern. So Snapchat was talked about a lot, but Snapchat kind of has the built-in mechanism of being temporary. Like, of course, yeah, people can take screenshots, I believe, but so that wasn't as strong an issue in our findings in terms of concerns about sort of presentation of self in social media. It was more about social media as a means to keep in touch with multiple groups of people, often more or less at the same time. I'm just trying to think of any exceptions. And yeah, one thing we did definitely find was the idea of public drinking was seen as something quite stigmatized and as something the stereotype of the chav came up quite a bit, and there was a kind of rejection of drinking in public spaces like parks, and that being seen as something that was just not acceptable or desirable by some of the participants, for sure. And that was kind of stronger in the whole than kind of explicit stereotypical ideas around gender. So with gender, it tended to be more about practices. So there was kind of a reproduction of stereotypical gender roles, but that tended to be more at the level of describing practices, like the young women often provided food, or talked about taking photographs to create memories and things like that, in a way that the boys sort of didn't, and young men didn't to the same extent. But in terms of kind of stereotypes or obvious presentations of self around gender norms, it wasn't as strong as in previous research. And that was a lot of our participants were interviewed in schools, in educational settings like secondary schools or sixth form colleges. And I wonder if that has a role here in terms of kind of shaping what they told us. That's a reflection I have on that as well.
Thank you. Thanks. There's also some questions about the sampling for the university study, Laura. And I wonder, before we come to that, if you could explain about red brick and post-92 universities as well. So a little bit about the context of that for an international audience. And then we'll come to Dan's question after that. So if you could just kind of set that UK context.
Yeah, sorry, I should have borne that in mind earlier. So red brick is our universities that were formed in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in industrial cities. So Manchester, Nottingham, Birmingham. So the major UK industrial cities, universities that are about 100 to 150 years old. Whereas post-92 are universities that were formerly spaces of vocational or technical learning that became universities after 1992. after following a change in the law.
Thanks. Great. I'm going to go on to familiar face Diane Gosler, please, to ask your question about the study sample, Diane. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, yes, I'm Diane Gosler. I'm a service user. I was interested to know, because as far as I remember, there were 14 women interviewed and 7 men. And I just wondered why there was that disparity between women and men. Is it just that there were more women to take a sample from, or was there some other reason?
Yeah, I suspect more women volunteered, and that's just a kind of one slice of the overall sample. So the overall sample is 141 people. Is it even to gender? I don't believe it's quite even to gender, but it's more even than that. That was just 2 in that age group happened to volunteer that were university students.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you. And on a similar topic as well, we've got a question from Stephanie Sersley. Thanks, Stephanie.
Hi, I was just curious about, I know in your study you looked at the experiences of university students. I was just curious about the experiences of those who don't go on to university. Yeah, I in my note, I had said that perhaps their socializing in their workplace looks quite different than that of the first-year university student. But surely there must be significant numbers of young people who don't go on to university.
Yeah, so first, yeah, thank you for that. Firstly, in relation to the wider literature, yeah, there's a huge literature on young people's alcohol consumption, including those who don't go on to university. Well, I won't say huge, but including those who don't go on to university. Secondly, the university students paper was the first paper that I wrote, and I intend to now move on to looking at those in our sample who didn't, young adults who didn't go on to university. And what I've seen initially, just reading some of the transcripts, is that, yeah, exactly as you say, workplaces often become sites of ritualized heavy drinking. And again, it seems to be, to some extent, about transition. It seems to be about how you get to know people and kind of develop like a kind of shortcut to intimacy, as opposed to necessarily something that is stable in long term. But we'll be looking, I hope to look more, subject to my line manager's approval, hope to look more at that in the future.
Thank you. And there's another couple of questions kind of following on from that. So I wonder if we can go to Rosie Mackay to ask her question, and then to Sarah Pete, and maybe take the 2 questions together, Laura. So Rosie, first of all, thanks.
Hi, I'm Rosie Mackay. I'm actually an education manager. I'm quite interested in, I guess, the opportunities, if they are there, and if the evidence suggests it'd be worth exploring for change post-pandemic. Thinking about the fact that universities established that welcome, if you like, through Freshers' Week and that drinking culture, and the impact that 2 years of not having a Freshers' Week, not having those sort of norms established, how they've impacted on the well-being of students. And I guess there's positive and negative impacts on that. And whether or not there's any learning from those 2 years that could be taken forward, and opportunities to change practices in terms of establishing those new relationships when students move to university or college, that might actually improve well-being and outcomes for young people as they make that transition.
Thank you. And Sarah Pete?
Hiya. I had something on the back of the university thing, and then I had a separate question which was to do the young people in the high school. So which one was it?
It was the university comment. You were talking about the
Yes.
reduction of clubs on mental health, that I thought kind of followed on quite nicely from the previous.
The NUS used to conduct research, so it was just to link into the fact that they had a lot of research surveys they done on alcohol and drug trends for a number of years. So I don't know if that would be helpful for people that wanted to see more context for that. if anybody was interested, but also that they have done research on the back of COVID-19 on mental health and well-being stuff. And there might be questions in that's on alcohol consumption and socialization that might have been handy for people that were interested in that as well. But I don't know if it is there, it's just that it might be, I don't know, I hadn't looked it up yet. But it's just to highlight it.
Thank you. Laura.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll look into that. So Rosie, we actually intend to do follow-up, well, we hope to do follow-up research with participants. And some of them will be the people that you're talking about. So they were sort of, what, roughly 17 in 2019 and will now have experienced transitions, either not necessarily to university, but we can certainly look at those who do as well. So we're hopeful of revisiting this next year and be able to look at some of the questions that you raise, at least in terms of drinking and health behaviours.
Thank you. And moving on to another element that you were talking about as well, Lucy Westerman, who says Vic H here, so I'm thinking you might be from Australia. Could you ask a question about vaping?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And yeah, sorry, I'm a bit of an interloper from Australia here late at night.
No, you're most welcome. Lovely to have you.
Yeah. We actually recently moved back from the UK, and so I'm quite familiar with the landscape there, but also very aware that here in Australia, and I think also there in the UK, there's an increase in vaping use, nicotine vaping use amongst this exact age group. And I guess my question is, if you're seeing obviously the health behaviour in school-age children, so research often focuses on tobacco use and other risk-taking behaviour, is nicotine vape use included, because it's a big concern here, and we're sort of trying to figure out how to navigate that. If alcohol use is decreasing, but meanwhile nicotine use through vaping is actually on the up, is there a link in that risk-taking behaviour?
I'm not aware of us having explicitly included it in our research, and I think that might partially be due to sort of a lack of data. I'm not sure if all the surveys we use have enough waves of vaping questions to make any useful conclusions about that, but it's something that we've been interested in, sort of on while that's going on, sort of increases in young people vaping. But as far as I'm aware, we've not done any work on that. And Laura is not butting in, which means that she probably also doesn't think we have. So yeah, sorry, can't help. But yeah, it's very important.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. I imagine there is somewhere, and I will ask Maddie about it, but I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, it would be fascinating to find out, I think, because obviously it's an alternative, currently perceived as a low risk substance by, comparative to tobacco smoking. And so I think there's some really interesting parallels there if there's a shift across amongst young people. How do we manage that, particularly if it's not regulated in the same way as tobacco smoking is, or is going in a different direction. So yeah, thank you. Wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. It's a really important point. And now, feeling slightly like Eurovision, I'd like to go over to Denmark now and talk to Freya Jorgensen, please. Got an interesting point here in the chat, Freya. Would you like to ask your question?
I'm not sure if the question.
Sorry, Freya, we can't hear you very well. Is it possible to speak up a little bit, or maybe put your video off?
So I don't know if it's working. Yeah, sorry, there's not a question there. It was more like a comment on the high school students.
I'm sorry, Freya, we can't really hear you. I'm just going to read out your comments and see if Laura or Inge have got any comments. So Freya says, in Denmark, the same discussions are going on, but among young people in first year of high school, 16-year-olds, the same mechanism with alcohol at stake, with creating new friendships and being part of the social life. part of the problem is that a lot of traditions and social events are centered around alcohol in Danish schools. So I just wondered if either of you wanted to comment on that, the kind of drinking cultures, I guess, in different countries.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think for most of our 16-year-olds, it wasn't something associated with their school. It might involve friendship groups partially co-located with school or from school, but I think overall there's quite a separation from school as an institution, or the institutions of the school, if you like, or educational institutions, and drinking. Whereas at universities, it was far more immersed. Drinking was far more embedded in the life of being a student. So no, that wasn't so visible. It was definitely something they did separate from, but their networks would often overlap with school. It could also be other groups of friends from various different sources, like sports or other activities they participated in. But the school itself wasn't implicated directly in any cases I can think of.
Thank you. I'd like to go on now to the study that Inge talked about on gaining access to alcohol. And it wasn't quite clear, Inge, and it's probably my lack of understanding about when you were talking about getting alcohol from friends. I was wondering if that's what we call a jump-in in Scotland, which is when you kind of get your older friends to go to off license for you, and they might get something to drink out of it or a bit of money out of it. Is that what you're talking about there?
It's unclear in the data. So okay. We have questions about buying, where it's very clear that when they say they're buying it from their friends, that there's a transaction. But what's less clear is in the getting, whether there's an implicit sort of, I get yours next time sort of exchange or another transaction in place, or whether this is more likely to be a gift. Or so, knowing young people, we assume that this is not just altruism, but from the data we have, it's only really like, where did you get the drink from if you didn't buy it, which is a very different question from what did you do in return for, did you bring the snacks or something else? Like, what's the sort of implicated transaction there? And I think there's very little known so far about sort of what's behind the data. What do we know young people do when they are sort of exchanging alcohol together? So yeah, I don't really know, but it's possible that that is one of the mechanisms, that there's an older friend who is allowed to buy it and who will do that. Yeah. I
think that would be a really fascinating study to look at it, because my feeling would be it's partly transactional, but it's partly, somebody did that for you when you were younger, so you do it for others, and whether it's an older brother or sister, or whether it's a cousin, or whether it's people that are just kind of hanging around off license, and what the local knowledge is about where is it easy to buy drink if you're underage or on the border, and how that works. I think that would be really interesting. And on the same topic, can I go over to Jay Leggett, please, asking about teenagers and parents? I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. It just comes up in the chat as Jay Leggett.
The person says they don't have a mic, so I think if you read out the question.
Sorry, I haven't managed to read down that far. Okay, the comment is, sorry about that. The comment is, I wonder if the acceptance that teenagers will drink and an agreement that the parents will allow them to have alcohol if adults are present to monitor what and how much they consume is more prevalent in parents of teens now who may have been consuming it without adult supervision in their adolescent years. Has age of parents played a factor in realizing we cannot remove all the risks, but we can minimize them, and it's no longer as appealing if it's not forbidden?
Yeah, that was our first thought, really, especially when you see that sort of decrease and then the increase back up to sort of drinking or being given the alcohol by parents. Unfortunately, we don't have the age of the parents in our data. We know that parents, that there's, alongside sort of all the things that are going on with the youth drinking decline, also parents are getting older. There are different factors in play that sort of decide who becomes a parent and when. And that is, I mean, we think that's very likely that that plays a role, but we don't have the data to back that up. But if you know of any data sources, that would be great. But yeah, we think, I mean, anecdotally, it certainly seems the case that more people, sort of younger parents now, have a more permissive stance on drinking than perhaps parents did 20 years ago. But I don't think we know.
Yeah, and sorry, just in relation to the qualitative research, it comes out there as well that certainly the people that we interviewed who are now in their 30s don't talk about their parents, talk about drinking as something quite separate from their parents, whereas the teenagers talk more about their parents offering it to them either at home or to take with them to parties. And they also talk about keeping in touch with their parents over text, and that being a kind of means through which parents monitor their context or conduct. And if you think about it, that's one of the things about technology, is that other people are there with you even when they're not with you. So that is something that we're kind of thinking about more in a paper for KBS, for a conference that's coming up.
Excellent, thank you very much. We haven't really talked about the, marketing of the alcohol industry here, and I'd like to go back to Lucy Westerman, to our Australian correspondent, who's got a question about this. Lucy.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of conversation about those socio-cultural, I guess, family and friends environments and university setting that are influencing children and young people's culture, but also in the university setting. And I guess I'm very aware that there is often, there's a lot of evidence that industry pushes alcohol quite heavily, particularly spirits, but alcohol quite heavily for initiation programs. Essentially they get past that 18 plus age gate and they go for it. And, Smirnoff and vodkas and, heavy drinking is really encouraged in a quite unethical kind of way. Was there anything that came through in the research that you were doing to sort of suggest that that is influencing how the culture is being shaped in universities? And obviously the last 2 years has been a bit peculiar in that regard, but we also saw a lot of marketing of, COVID safe distancing opportunities in nightclubs. And so I'm wondering whether we're seeing a shift in that regard to, for the industry to continue to push, but just in slightly more creative ways, perhaps.
So in the interviews, we didn't collect evidence of that. I think anecdotally, it's completely visible on university campuses. And I think kind of what happens is meeting other students in particular kinds of contexts, but then that's spilling out into the local nighttime economy. And that's perhaps one of the key places where they get sort of plummeted with all these messages and all this marketing. So we don't have original data on that, but certainly nothing we've found is inconsistent with the wider concerns about industry.
It would be interesting to understand if university, because obviously there was an ambassador program happening sort of pre-pandemic where young influencers were ambassadors for alcohol products, and they would be using social media within the university kind of setting to promote the culture of alcohol use as sort of young people. So I'm wondering whether that's, that's sort of been shifting, where you're handing out alcohol around a university is something that perhaps isn't or is going to be happening a lot more as universities go back.
Thanks, Lucy. And now I'd like to go over to Ireland to Sheena Gilheany, please, about alcohol control policies. Sheila, thank you.
Hi, Carol. Firstly, thanks to all the presenters. It's incredibly interesting. My query, and it's not really a query, it's more a puzzle for myself. It is great to see youth drinking in decline, but I wonder, do we have a bit of a problem in terms of putting forward then arguments for the need for alcohol control policies. Very often, I mean, I'm very aware that alcohol consumption is a problem right across the whole of the population. It's not just about youth, but I know also from dealing, you know, with how to make things happen in a political context, that people often respond better to, the youth of today, we have to do something about that. And so they are up for doing things like minimum unit pricing, controls on marketing or whatever, and things like that. So I just wonder if we have any thoughts on how best to present this, how to look at this, how to make sure that we don't lose momentum around alcohol control policies in a kind of a, oh gosh, sure, everything's grand, we're fine, no need to worry about things. Things have managed to correct themselves without too much hard or too much pain from a control policy thing. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's that's certainly difficult. I think I would highlight that because we don't know what's caused it, really, we also don't know if that's going to maintain. And I had a quick look through the participant list, and I don't think he's here, but as Harry Sumnall will tell you, for a long time alongside the declining youth drinking, drug use has been declining in young people. But it seems that since 2016, 2018, that has rapidly increased again without really knowing why. So it's just because it's declining now that unfortunately doesn't necessarily mean it will keep declining. And also, you know, we see, for example, in the study by Abby, that it's people from lower socioeconomic status who might not be seeing the same declines, and these things might be missed out. But yeah, I take your point that it's easy to point to, oh, the poor children, and if the poor children are actually doing quite well at the moment, what do we do then? But this certainly doesn't mean that all the children are doing as well as we'd like them to, I think.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I've inserted a link in the chat to a paper that some colleagues have written about this, about thinking about this issue. And the other thing I'd add is looking at Abby's research on growing inequalities, or inequalities in health, that actually some people becoming part of that healthier cluster means it also means a kind of pulling apart or polarization. So it's certainly not the case that we need to stop thinking about alcohol control.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. I think just following on from that, John Moody, who's had to leave, is asking, perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek, should we now refocus our policy lens on the older adults who have the bulk of harms given the decline in youth studies, in youth drinking? Does that mean it's solved and we're done?
Well, yeah, so I'll go first and get no. But there is a case some people have made for targeting heavier drinkers, and yeah, often those have been that age, but no, obviously we can't forget the rest of the population.
Yeah, I'll butt into that to say, but also yes, perhaps it is worthwhile to focus more on the harms experienced by older drinkers. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that we don't know what's going to happen in older age for these generations yet. And as much as we obviously hope, and you know, the data points to that perhaps they are staying at lower levels of consumption as they go older. There's nothing to say whether or not it does, and it's really only a matter of time for us to know. But I think it's very much worthwhile to focus on older drinkers and the harms they're experiencing.
Thank you. Just on what we're talking about before, the concept of the jump in and the need for some more in-depth qualitative data, I'd like to go over to Ian Clark, who was involved in some research on minimum unit pricing. Of course, there's a huge suite of studies looking at minimum unit pricing, but Ian Clark was involved in looking at the impact of minimum unit pricing on young people. And Ian, would you like to make your comment about the jump in and any more information you've got about that, please?
Yeah, it was really just to confirm what you said. Certainly in that research we did, which was with 50 young people who were aged 13 to 17. The jump in was by far the main way that they were acquiring alcohol. There was nobody in our group of young people who were acquiring it through stealing. What was really interesting in the whole research, and it wasn't just in terms of how they acquired the alcohol, but there was definitely a difference, a socioeconomic difference in how they acquired it, but also the amount they were drinking, the frequency they were drinking. And I think that's a huge issue. And yes, there's and you guys made the point in your really good presentations. Yes, there's a decline overall, but I think, you know, there's a group of young people, you know, who we engaged with in our research, who are disadvantaged and marginalised, who are really, you know, their alcohol consumption is really quite different to the general trends. So they're not really a question, just a comment on our research, but I think there's a real kind of topic there for further research.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I think probably to point out is something that is a difficulty with the data we're using, is that these are, you know, these are young people, they're teenagers filling them in school.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes you have to take things they're reporting with a grain of salt, and to point out that the kids who are not in school are not in these surveys, and these tend to be the kids who are doing quite a lot worse off. So, yeah.
Thank you. Comment here from Tom Fernell Reeds. Tom, do you want to come in here about the framing of youth drinking, to go back to that point?
I can try to. You've just caught me moving between the kitchen and the office. I was washing up my plates while I was saying that. Yeah, I guess just to reiterate my comment that perhaps the media response, but the framing from an older generation of adults who possibly feel threatened by the decline in youth drinking, because it's what they did, and it was assumed that that's what young people do. And now reports of this change seem to be met with this response that, oh, you know, they're boring. Young people are boring. Young people are too safe. They're glued to their phones, and they're just really attacked for it. And whenever I've talked to my students in one of my modules I teach about this decline, we always get onto that topic of, well, the emphasis on sort of judging young people for drinking for many years, multiple generations, and then you have a decline, and it flips and says, oh, you're all boring, you're not drinking. So does that indicate that there's my comment was that it's more telling about the older generation than the younger generation in a way, as their response to it, but also is it implying that there is some sort of normative sweet spot where young people do drink a bit and do socialize a bit and do experiment a bit, but I don't know. I think there were a few comments earlier relating to you know, socialization and belonging and connection, and those things are really important. Laura's comments about the university campuses, where having spaces young students can feel connected without alcohol being central to it is so important, because you don't want to lose that ability. That there is a value to that, that students drink and bond, particularly in their first year when they're away from home. It's a matter of what replaces it, I think.
Yeah, poor young people can't win. There's nothing young people can do that they won't be criticized for, I think.
Yeah, I think it does show you the kind of exceptionalism of the year sort of 1960 to the early 2000s in terms of what was going on with alcohol culturally and historically. So the kind of increase, you know, the capacity to sell it to different places, which is policy changes in the early 1960s, the rise of supermarkets in the 80s and 90s in particular. And so actually it shows us kind of the unique character of these of previous generations, I guess what gets called the baby boomer generations, and a little bit older, a little bit younger, in terms of overall alcohol consumption patterns. It kind of puts them in their place historically, I think, to some extent. And that, to me, that's quite interesting to think about.
Just quickly to add to that, I wonder if qualitative research within families is useful, because to see the dynamic about how alcohol and drinking is negotiated within families is very telling. And I know Laura and I have been discussing this in a book we've been putting together, an edited book. But the sort of the negotiation between generations, and is it a case that the heavy drinking families, that there's alcohol consumed in families and those values are being passed on, or do you have quite stark switches, you know, between generations, and how those are felt? It would be interesting to know, I think.
Yeah, that's part of our further work is to look at possibly doing more kind of ethnographic and intergenerational interviewing as well. Because I think you're right, I'd be interested to see it in situ, see it in practice.
Fantastic. We're just coming up to the end of the session now. A few people have had to leave already, but I would like to thank very much our speakers, Laura and Inge. That's been such an interesting and fascinating session today. I'd also like to really thank all the participants for your comments and your questions. There's lots of interesting points and links in the chat. I'd like to also thank the SHAAP team, so that's Eleanor, Jane and Chloe, for doing the tech and making everything work. And I very much hope that you can join us for our next Alcohol Occasional seminar on the 23rd of May, which is on navigating the complexity of harm and care, a qualitative study of self-harm and alcohol use, with Amy Chandler and Annie Taylor. But for now, I'd like to thank our speakers, and I think we can still do a clap, even though we're not in the same room. So thank you very much, Inge and Laura. Thank you. Everybody.
Yeah, thank you to you, Carol, as well, and to the organisers, to SHAAP and SARN.